And so today we're going to be looking at this idea of being trusted with the gospel. So with that being said, I want to ask the question this morning, what does it mean to trust? Or what does it mean to be trusted? Maybe you've been trusted with something before, or you've trusted someone. But I have a standard definition here of what it means to trust. It's a person or thing on whom which someone relies. There's a good synonym. If somebody trusts you to do something, then it's someone relies on you. They're relying on you, and it's almost to the point where if you don't come through, there's a hole or something that's not going to get done. I know for my job, I am the director of transportation at the company I work for, and I have a team underneath me. And just management 101 is that we don't want to be micromanagers, hands-on, and move people like robots. We want to train those people and then trust those people to do the job that we've asked them to do, which takes it off of my plate so I can do other things, and then things get done. But those people, I rely on those people. I'm trusting those people, right? Which leads us to the second definition. It's something committed or entrusted to one's care for use of safekeeping as an office, duty, or the like. Responsibility or a charge. So giving a charge or giving a responsibility to somebody and having somebody that you rely on to do that. We all understand that in some form of, even in parenthood, we want our children to be, we want to be able to trust our children, right? And be able to rely on them that they're going to do the things that, we ask them to do, or things that we're teaching them to do as they get out into the world, especially when we're done supervising them. Well, what we're going to find this morning in our text is Paul's going to mention to the Thessalonians that God has entrusted something to us. So let's find what that is. We're going to pick up our reading this morning in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, and we're going to read in verse number, we're going to start reading at verse number 1. And then we'll go down and take our text from verse 4. But Paul says, "For you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. For our appeal does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please man, but to please God who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed, God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become very dear to us." We'll stop right there in our reading. Last week we looked at that phrase, and we concentrated what it meant. Paul said, not only were we willing to give you the gospel, we were willing to give you ourselves. And so we talked last week about what it meant to give ourselves to people, not to just be part of what's going on so somebody can check off a box or be part of a church or something like that, but to actually love people and give ourselves for people and understand their lives and to be loving toward those people. And so this week we want to concentrate on what he means in verse number 4 when he says that, and we're going to look at the context around this in a list, but he says, "But just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel." And so I titled the message this morning, "Being Trusted with the Gospel." And I'm going to tell you, I was challenged as a pastor and as a preacher this week as I was studying this to think the fact that it's just like I trust people to do things, God has entrusted me. And the idea that we want to get across this morning is God's trusted us with the gospel. We need to keep it right. We need to keep it pure. I think I've got that on the next slide of really what we want to look at. We must preach the gospel, that we have been entrusted with accurately and with the right motives. Because it's not our gospel. It's God's gospel, and He's given it to us. And when we look at it that way, Paul's going to say, hey, that's the way I looked at it, and here's what He's going to show us some things that he did not do because he looked at the gospel and trusted to Him. But our side note is, here's the other thing, is what makes a person want to accept the gospel? And what makes a person want to come to it? What makes a person want to accept it and commend to it, to join with it, which is what faith is. Faith is believing it. But we're going to find some examples when we're looking at this list of some things that we don't want, how we don't want to preach the gospel, because we don't want people to attach themselves to the gospel wrongly. We want the message to be pure so people come to the gospel rightly. Why? Because God's given it to us and entrusted to us. I wish I could say, sometimes I stand up here as a pastor or just as a father or as a husband, and you don't want to brag on things that you've done wrong in your life, but nonetheless, before, not even before, as I've come to Christ, there have been times I've messed up, which proves to me that I need Christ, because I'm not what I'm supposed to be. But when it comes to this trust thing, there's one illustration comes to my mind, even though it's going to put me out. I'm going to use it, okay? I had a job at one time delivering papers. If you may or may not have done that, if you haven't done it, I don't recommend it, really. It's really a difficult job, because you have to get up early in the morning, go fold your papers, and you got to go. And I was doing this job, and I had went with a guy, and he had showed me the route. I went with him a week or two, which is usually what happens, and then I was going to go. It was the first week that it was a fill-in. That's really what I was, and it came time that this guy went on vacation, and I was going to fill in for him. So that day I got up and I went, got all the papers, and I had somewhere I had to go. I had to be somewhere at a certain time. So of course I'm thinking, I'll get all this done and I'll be there. Well, things did not work out the way I want them to work out. And I couldn't find where I was going, and I still had probably half of those papers left when it was time for me to get to where I needed to go. And I had to make a choice. And I'll just be shamefully, and things have gotten right. I made things right, whatever, but I made the wrong choice. And I said, you know what? These papers aren't getting delivered today. And I end up just disposing of those papers. Now you're saying, now I understand. I told you I was going to expose myself, all right? Well, gosh, it was wrong. I was trusted to do something. I was relied upon to do something, and I failed miserably. Now, sometimes your brain doesn't work right, especially for men. And I've been told men's brains doesn't work right, that you can actually do something and not think about the consequences, right? If you think, I can do this and I'm totally fine. I was an idiot, because, if people aren't going to get their papers, then people are going to call and say they didn't get their papers. And needless to say, it came back, and so I had to go forward and say, look, I apologize, I'm sorry, this is what happened. And then ended up going back getting things right. And let's just say, very forgiving, but not very trusting me again to want to do that until we figure out some stuff, okay? And that's, actually, I never went back and did it again. But the point I'm trying to get across this morning is, we may all have that kind of story in our brain. It may be that you were a child. It may be you were an adolescent. It may be you were an adult. I don't know. We all make mistakes. We all make decisions that are wrong. But you may have had a time where you were trusted and relied on, and you failed because of that. Well, what we're going to find today is, one, that we have been trusted with the gospel, and that we need to give all the diligence in the world to make sure we do the things and don't do the things that Paul's going to point out in this passage. But the other thing that I want to make clear this morning is, wherever we fail, Jesus succeeds. And that is the gospel. We would never be able to succeed and to work and to be perfected and to please God with our own righteousness. Our failures should point us to Jesus and the reason that He came in the first place, which is to pay for our sin, so that we could have forgiveness through Him. But more than that His righteousness, His perfect record would be on our account, so that we could be made right with God and see Him one day. So keep those two things in mind as we go through this list this morning. We do have more than 3 points this morning. I'm going to lay them out, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on all of them. But I want to look at this morning, how did Paul keep the gospel pure as he knew God had entrusted it with him? All right, let's look at this. Number one, how do we do that? Well, number one, we don't change it. We don't change the gospel. The gospel is the same. God gave us the gospel through His Word. And we're going to see that's what Paul says here. Look what he says in verse number 2. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated in Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. Don't pass those words. We could go back and look at the book of Acts. Philippi, they were thrown in jail for the gospel. Then they escaped. They did see God work. They escaped, and then they came down to Thessalonica. They could have easily said, whoa, you remember what that gospel did, the way we were putting it? It threw us in jail. How about we just shift it a little bit? Let's change it. It could have been very, very easy and tempting to do that. But look what he says in verse 3. For our appeal, the word appeal means our persuasion, the way we're giving the gospel so that you can come to it, does not spring from what? From error. In other words, there is no changing of the gospel. We did not come to you and say, hey, come to this gospel, here it is, and we change what he received from Jesus, which is whom he received it from. We could go look at another epistle in the book of Galatians where Paul gives his testimony, and he says that he actually received this gospel from the mouth of the Lord Jesus Christ because he didn't know Jesus on his life and when he was buried and rose from the dead. He didn't know him then. Christ came to him after his resurrection and saved him on the road I was going to say road Emmaus, but he was only Damascus. Thank you. Emmaus is another road, another book. That's not it. But he came to him and he said, Jesus gave me this gospel. So he did not change the gospel because he understood that he had been given something and it was trusted to him and he wanted to keep it pure. So number one, if we want to keep the gospel right, we don't want to change it. So what is the gospel? And I have it just down, and a gospel is something why we're doing it, what we're doing. It's the whole Bible, but in its simplest form is the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is that Jesus came to this earth and was the God-man, the miracle, the thing that everybody just doesn't, it's not easy to comprehend when we understand that the one and true living God, who there's only one, became a human. He was flesh and blood, and his name was Jesus Christ. And that person came, lived a perfect life, preached the gospel, and then died the perfect death. And on the cross, he became your sin and my sin. That's what the Bible teaches. And so when Jesus was on the cross, our sin was poured on him. And the Bible tells us this wonderful exchange took place, that his righteousness is applied to us. And when he rose from the dead, then death was defeated, Satan was defeated, and he has the power in him alone, through his death, burial, and resurrection, to forgive us of our sins because we are in him, in Jesus. That's the gospel. And so we don't want to take any part of that and change it. It's just as important who Jesus is than what Jesus did. If Jesus was not who Jesus said he was, then it doesn't have the same effect when Jesus did what Jesus did. We must have both. So we want to make sure the gospel stays accurate. That's how do we keep it pure? We don't live immorally. This is what he says. Verse 3, for our appeal does not spring from error or impurity. Literally there, he's looking at his conduct, and he's going to say, he says this a couple times. Verse 1 of chapter 2, for you yourselves know. He's looking at the Thessalonians. He's saying, you guys know, I was there with you. We ate together. You sat with me. We were grouped together as I was preaching the gospel for a time. They knew him. He says, you know, brothers. He's going to use that same thing again. Verse 9 of chapter 2. For you remember, brothers, our labor and our toil. We worked night and day that we may not be a burden to any of you. He's throwing his character out there, and he's saying, transparency. Look at how we were to you. You know it. And his answer is, we lived morally. Does that mean perfectly? No. But we ought to be striving to be moral. We ought to be right. We ought to do things that are right. And that's where it goes with the message needs to be right, but our motives need to be right. As we're preaching the gospel, our motives need to be right. Which goes back to last week of him saying, you guys, we loved you so much. It wasn't that we just wanted to give you the gospel. We wanted to give you ourselves. And guys, I'm just going to be honest with you. That's something I work at daily. And God has to work in me daily. That I am selflessly given of myself, because I'm naturally, and we all are naturally, selfish. We want to do things that we want to do. And that's okay to do things we want to do. But when it comes to the gospel and God's will for our life, he wants us to be selfless. He wants us to serve others, serve our family, serve our friends, serve our church for the gospel's sake. And so he's putting his character on the line, and he says, we came to you not with any error, and we didn't come with you with any impurity. So we need to be looking at our lives, making sure that we're striving to be pure. We're striving to be moral in our lives, as a family, as a mother, as a father, and as a friend, as a co-worker. We're doing things right. Are you the one that, at your job, somebody comes up to you and says, Oh, I know what took place there because I know such and such. They're always going to cut that corner. Or they always just turn a blind eye. Now, we ought to be the ones that's always doing right. We should be the ones that aren't dumping the newspapers in the trash can. We should be the ones that are doing what's right. But don't, and that's why I prefaced the way I prefaced it. We're not going to always do what's right, even though we should be striving. And if you're born again, you've accepted the gospel, God gives you that striving because he lives inside of you. But even when we do fail, run to the cross and understand that Jesus died for our sin, right? He died for our sin. And then ask for forgiveness, confess that sin, and come back and say, God, I know I messed up there. Will you help me not mess up again? I want to be a person that's like Christ, that's pure in my motives, pure in my morals. So number 2, he said, no impurity. Number 3, don't deceive. This one really spoke to me. That they didn't have any error, any impurity, and any attempt to deceive. He could have walked into Thessalonica and he could have preached the gospel in a way where, again, we're looking at motives. That, and I kind of take it to today's world that we just want to see a building filled. So whatever we need to do that. Well, that's not the right motive. Or some type of a bait and switch thing where you give a gospel of a message, and then when everybody starts coming, you turn and say, oh, no, no, I hate bait and switches. Man, that's the worst thing in the world. It just kills me when you find the punchline and you're like, oh, that's what he wanted. Because I really thought he meant this, and I was really liking that. No, we need to be so transparent from day one when we meet someone that we understand and they understand what the gospel is and what does God require of the church. There are things that God requires of his people. But never should we be putting more stuff on top of that. And I love the way Jesus says that his church should, in his saying, come unto me, all ye are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The things that Christ asks of us because he lives inside of us, they shouldn't be a burden. They ought to be a joy. That doesn't mean they always are, but they should be. And we ought to be transparent. We don't want to be deceiving. I had a lot of these things come up in emails and come up on Facebook and things like that, but the whole idea of I caught another one this week of this idea of God doing healing miracles. Now, you would ask me, do you think God still does miracles? And I would say hearty amen. Yes, I do. Do you think God heals? I would say yes, absolutely. But do I think that a person has the ability to have people come into their building and that he could heal them based off of his faith or their faith? Then I get pretty uneasy. Because the first thing that I think when I have somebody who's standing up there and he says, hey, God's working here and I've got special power and I can heal, my first thing is, why are you in your building? You should be at the hospitals. Like, if you got healing ability, you're in the wrong place. You're bringing sick people to you. You need to be going to the sick people, right? But there's something special about that. I'm just telling you, there's a whole nother story there and biblical evidence that I give, and I know there may be some different opinions on that kind of thing, but my whole point is, if it is or if it's not true, for those that know it's not true, there's a form of deceitfulness where you're trying to tell somebody that something can be done so that they would come in and give their money or give their, they have your attendance, whatever. But we want to be straightforward. If you can't heal, don't tell people you can heal. Hey, I can't heal. Just to be honest with you. If your leg is broke, go to the hospital. But hey, if God decides He wants to heal you, and there are times God has healed and done ways where doctors send back and say, I have no idea how that happened. Do I believe that happens? Absolutely. But I have no control over that, and all I can do is just pray that God will, but maybe He won't. I don't know. Sometimes He chooses not to for some reason. But we don't want to be deceitful. We want to be wide open, straightforward about what the gospel is, what the Bible says. Be transparent. All right, number 4. What else how do we do that? Don't be greedy. Don't be greedy. Look what he says in verse number verse 5. For we never came with words of flattery, meaning I'm trying to bring you up. I'm just persuasive words that really are fluffy words that don't mean anything, just so you'll come. No, we didn't do that, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. Now, when you hear the word greed, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Me, it's money. But as I started looking at this passage, I had to be honest with myself, and I said, you can be greedy, and it could be over other things. I mean, you could be greedy over other things. It doesn't have to be money, but money can be included in that. Paul doesn't point out the fact that he was greedy and the fact that he was preaching. Again, it goes back to this deceiving. He goes into a town and he says, I'm here. Again, remember, Thessalonica had never heard the gospel. This is first-time stuff. Paul comes in and he could have preached the gospel and brought people in so that he could start, drawing a huge salary. Don't have anything wrong with salary or people who are pastors that are paid full time. I'm not against that, but I am against if that's the motive, right? Like, I want to do that. That's the reason we're doing it. We've got to be careful with that. We've got to be careful that greed doesn't come into our heart and we're not preaching the gospel for the right motives and the right reasons, which is what we're trying to get at for Paul here. I love, even again, at verse 9, if you look at that, I think he supports this in chapter 2, verse 9. For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. Paul was a tent maker. So as Paul's going into Thessalonica preaching the gospel, he's building tents night and day. He said, because I didn't want to be a burden to you guys. And he even says he could have been a burden. In if you go down to verse number, where is that? Verse number 13, he said, we also thank God constantly for this, and when you receive the word of God, that's not it. But he also talks about how he could have done that because of the fact that they were apostles. Oh, I know what it is. It's verse 6. Nor did we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ. Verse 6. So we know Paul saying here, I was apostle, I could have done some things. I could have said, hey, I'm here to give the gospel. We know Paul talks about those that preach the gospel are worthy of their labor. But he chose not to. He gave that away freely and said, I'm working here because I don't want to be a burden to you. So why are you bringing all that up? For this point, that he wants this church to understand there's no greed in my heart. I'm not greedy. I don't want to grasp people. I don't want to grasp money. I don't want to grasp things. We can grasp things. We can be greedy for all kinds of things. Paul said, no, if I want to keep the gospel pure, which God gave to me, He entrusted it to me. It's not mine, it's His. I can't be greedy. I can't preach it in a pretext for greed. And then next, number 5. Don't preach to be pleased. This was one that spoke to me. And this is what he says, again, looking at verse number 6. Nor did we seek glory from people. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm a people pleaser by nature. That's just who I am. I don't like people not to like me. I have never been like that. When I was in high school, I think I was told that I was the class clown. I did not have many enemies. I didn't. Everybody liked me because I hated people not to like me. So I hung out with all different types of groups. I would go hang out with different people. I mean, people to like me. And it became, that in itself is not a necessarily bad thing, but if it comes to the point where you're giving a message to someone and that message could cause that person not to like you, but it's the truth, then you have a decision you have to make. Am I going to give this person the truth? And even though they need the truth, and in the end it would help them, initially they're going to hate my guts. Am I going to do it, or am I going to say, no, I'd rather want that person to like me. I want the person to like me. I don't want to go to bed at night knowing that there's somebody going to bed not liking me, you know? But that's what Paul's saying here. He said, as we were preaching this gospel that was entrusted to us, there's a truth. We've already looked at that. There's no error. He's already been stoned. He's already been thrown in jail because of this truth. There's a lot of people who didn't like him. He could have easily come to Thessalonica and said, you know what, I'm tired of this. I want these people to like me. I want people to like me. And so let's water this down. Let's change this to make it where it's user-friendly. It's easy on the ears. He says, I didn't do that though. He said, I didn't seek glory from people, whether from you or from others. But he says that he preached it not because of people to please man, verse number 4, but to please who? To please God. To please the person that actually gave us the gospel to entrust us with it. So he never gets away from this thing of, okay, Jesus, you've given me this. If we could take this gospel and kind of apply, Jesus is the gospel, and apply to what Jesus said in his parable of him himself being the pearl of great price. Think about that. Jesus has given us himself, the message of the gospel, and he says, hey, this is you, this is yours. It's pure, it's beautiful, it's the most valuable thing in all of the world, and it can cause so many people to be set free from their sin and be made right with me. It's yours. Don't fumble it. That's a good analogy. Don't fumble it. Okay? Keep it. Don't go out and change it. Don't go out and not let it mean anything because your life's not adjusting to it, because the gospel is life-changing. Okay? Don't go out and have the wrong motives and why you're doing it and deceiving people. No, that's not why I meant to give it to you. Don't go out and be greedy, and because you think you have this, you can get all of this. No, you got me. This is the most valuable thing. So everything else is just sub-value to the gospel. And so he also says, oh, by the way, I gave it to you. So don't look out here. If you look at that analogy and try to please people with it, no, please me because I gave it to you. And that's why, Paul's coming back here and he's saying, this is how we keep the gospel pure. And my heart, especially what we're doing here. I mean, we're planning a church. We want to get the gospel to this community, to Springville, to Spanish Fort, to Provo, to Utah County. It's the good news, and we want people to hear it. Why? Because it's life-changing. How do we know our sins are forgiven and that one day we're going to be with our Creator? How do we get back to that relationship? It's through the gospel that's been entrusted to us. We want to make sure that it is pure and that it's right. And then this morning, I just want to close with this idea of what he says, and we're going to look at a little bit more of this next week, as we're just going to have, this was kind of a don't. This is how you keep it pure, so the things you don't do. Next week, we're actually going to look at some things how he did it, and kind of bouncing off that idea again of giving himself to everyone, but I do want to just hint on this, and we'll look at it a little bit more next week, but look at verse number 7, where he's talking about giving of himself, but he uses this phrase, "But we are gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children." Do you know, we could have all of those other things right. Gospel's not changed. I'm not in it for greed. I'm entrusting it by God, so I'm going to keep it pure. I'm going to answer Him one day. But you could still, there's some people that just do things rough, I think He throws that in because, we've got 5 kids, and trust me, I was not the nursing mother on any of them. Guarantee that. That's just not, but I was with my wife, and she's been the mother of my children, and I've seen that happen. There's a gentleness there that I don't even think I could possibly have being a man. If you think about that newborn baby, when you think about that value of life, when you think about that mother's care over a child, and he describes that, he uses other analogies too, but he uses that analogy to say, this is how I came to you. We were gentle with you. And I think all of that being said, we've got to get back to this giving of ourselves to people, loving on people, which means accepting people and helping people where they are to know who God is and to teach the Bible to them. And so next week we'll pick up on that. But as we close, I want you, first of all, I just want you to think through in your hearts this morning, are you a believer of the gospel? That's number one. Have you trusted Christ? Maybe you need to know more information about that. Maybe you need to trust Him today. But have you trusted through the death and burial, resurrection in Him alone for salvation? And if not, let's chat or let's do it. There's nothing really to do. It's a faith. It's a belief in what's going on. And 2, if you have, then this doesn't just apply to pastors. It doesn't just apply to people behind the pulpit. We're all supposed to be in the ministry giving the gospel. So all these things, we have to check ourselves and just constantly say, am I in this? Do I recognize that God's given me something precious? And what He's given me has saved my soul. And now He wants me to pass that on. Am I passing on to the next person what was given to me, which has saved my soul? And am I doing it this way? I think we all need to, and we're going to pray in a minute and sing, but I think it's a time of just thinking in our hearts and recommitting that, yes, God, You've given me something. Help me not to just stumble it away. Lord, You can rely on me. I'm not going to throw this in the trash can. But God, if I do, I'm going to trust that Christ knew that and died for that. And maybe it's a time of confession, saying, God, I know I'm not right. I know I'm a sinner. I've failed. I've not been a person to be relied on. But Christ came, and so I'm running back to the cross, either for the first time or we need to constantly go back to the cross and fall at the feet of confess this. I know that Your death and Your resurrection, Your perfect life was in my place, so I could be right with God, not based upon what I do, but based upon what You do, what You did. It is finished. And so that may be something we need to do this morning. But whatever it is, I'm going to ask Jeff to come. We're going to pray, and we're going to sing a great song this morning as we close. What a friend we have in Jesus.